In the second half of Unit 2, we'll continue investigating developments in realism. Henry James in The Art of Fiction adds to the conversation about realism. Remember, we've been talking about William Dean Howells and the things that he has to say. This essay, The Art of Fiction, is included in our anthology. I've not assigned it, but you might want to check it out if you get the chance. In this essay, he writes, "The only reason for the existence of a novel is that it does attempt to represent life." So in a general way, he believes, as does William Dean Howells, that fiction should be faithful in representing life as we, or at least those in the upper middle classes, actually find it. Unlike Howells, who asserts a reality that is referential and shared, however, James places greater emphasis on inner reality, on life as it is mediated through the mind. We see this in, for example, Daisy Miller. The novel offers us a first-person peripheral narrator who only breaks into the first person 5 times during this novella. So only 5 times in a work that's fairly long. Many readers don't even notice this narrator, and if I ask what it's given in, people will often say it's third person. He is so peripheral that we don't know anything about him except for that he knows one of the main characters, Winterbourne. We never get into head of the title character, Daisy Miller. Instead, we get an impression of her that is filtered by Winterbourne, being filtered by this narrator whom we know nothing about. It's a little bit like the film Inception. We're never really sure what level of reality we're at. That's a longish introduction to Kate Chopin's Story of an Hour and Edith Wharton's Roman Fever. Like James, these two writers offer a version of realism that highlights subjectivity, or the inner mind. By highlighting female subjectivity, these stories by Chopin and Wharton also offer previously overlooked or ignored points of view, while also showing us how identity can be shaped by prevailing attitudes about gender. Let's take a closer look at Mrs. Mallard in A Story of an Hour. This seems like a fairly straightforward narrative with a twist at the end. It begins with a married woman mourning the death of her husband, only to find herself relieved that she is finally free, as she exclaims. An unsophisticated reader might just write her off as heartless. And she does literally have a problem with her heart. In the first line of the story, we're told that she was afflicted with a heart trouble. This, of course, is too simplistic, and it misses evidence that the news of Mr. Mallard's death affects her deeply, and in a negative way. Upon learning of his death, Mrs. Mallard's, or Louise's, first response is to weep at once, with sudden, wild abandonment, we're told. And there's nothing to suggest that she is putting on appearances. She is sad, and she knows Mr. Mallard had been a kind and good husband. Chopin writes, "She knew that she would weep again when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death, the face that had never looked save with love upon her." But when she begins to suspect that she isn't entirely sad, that she's maybe a little bit relieved, we are told that she was striving to beat that emotion back with her will. Notice how Chopin signals a change in mood with a change in weather. As Louise looks out the window, she sees, in the open square before her house, the tops of trees that were all aquiver with the new spring life. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. In the street below, a peddler was crying his wares. The notes of a distant song which someone was singing reached her faintly, and countless sparrows twittering in the eaves. Spring is in the air, and it represents the possibilities of a new life for Louise as a single woman. Keep in mind that as she begins noticing this positive sense of freedom, she tries really hard to stop feeling that way. She doesn't want to, nor has she planned on feeling happy that her husband is gone. She isn't an awful person. For a more sophisticated reading, we need to consider Louise's unfiltered response in the context of her life. Chopin's given us lots of indications that Louise lives a very restricted life. Indeed, she doesn't blame her husband. Chopin doesn't blame her husband. Instead, she points to the social institution of marriage. Newly single, Louise understands that she would live for herself. There would be no powerful will bending hers to that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. Notice that Chopin doesn't just say men. She isn't placing her blame on individuals. Instead, marriage for Chopin, and probably 19th century marriage, is an institution that constrains both men and women. Notice how she is known as Mrs. Mallard until close to the story's end, signaling that she is restricted in marriage in this role. Chopin also demonstrates Louise's restricted circumstances with other literary details. This is a very well-crafted story. Louise is restricted, of course, by her weak heart and also by the story's length. Louise's story is very brief. It's not even 2 pages in our anthology. And she experiences only an hour of freedom, hence the title, Story of an Hour. The setting is also in a home where Louise mostly stays in a single room, so a pretty confined space. And as soon as she leaves that room, her freedom ends. She never even gets to experience her newfound sense of independence outside. More significantly, Louise is restricted by the ways that she is defined. The last line is, "When the doctors came, they said she had died of heart disease, of joy that kills." Not knowing what has been going on internally, the male doctors misinterpret what ails her in their prognosis. Not only is she restricted by the institution of marriage, but she is restricted by the role of happy wife foisted upon her. Chopin's propensity to tackle such issues in her fiction is the mark of a realist. Before we take a look at the story by Wharton, let's return for a moment to Howells and James as a way to broaden our definition of literary realism. As an aside, this is something that you'll need to be able to do for your exam. Howells affirms that the reader is the ultimate arbiter of a fiction. Of a fiction's realism, and that the only test of a novel's truth is his own knowledge of life. So in other words, readers use their own experience in order to gauge whether or not a story is real. James, however, asks readers to go further than just our own immediate experience. He argues, and this is in The Art of Fiction, you can find this quotation on page 908, "Experience is never limited, and it is never complete. It is an immense sensibility, a kind of huge spider web of the finest silken threads, suspended in the chamber of consciousness and catching every airborne particle in its tissue." James wants more out of a fiction. He insists on the power to guess the unseen from the seen, to trace the implication of things, to judge the whole piece by the pattern. This idea goes on to influence an entire generation of literary scholars who come after James. Wharton, for a while, regarded herself as a disciple of James, and their friendship and correspondence spanned many years. When we read Roman Fever, we'll follow James's observation to judge the whole piece by the pattern. Like James's work, Wharton's realism focuses on the leisured classes, people with the cultural comforts, education, and resource to concentrate on the connourship of human relationships, complex motives, and the intricacies of consciousness. They don't have to waste a lot of time working and trying to clothe themselves. Unlike James, however, Wharton's social elite can seem haunted and lost. These two women in Roman Holiday have both harbored a secret and years of buried resentment, and we learn toward one another. The story misleads us a bit, and readers often want to read the ending as one character triumphing over another. And I think that is a way to read the ending, but perhaps it doesn't allow us to get at the larger social commentary that Wharton is making. Many of us would like to think Grace Ansley wins over Alida Slade. She's the quieter one and doesn't seem quite so mean. We want to see her as getting the better of a woman who is trying to lord it over her. I say the narrative is misleading because one of the problems the story brings out is the way social norms limit women, their choices, and their lives. Both Mrs. Ansley and Mrs. Slade each have an identity and a sense of self-worth that is dependent on a man. This connects them to Mrs. Mallard in Chopin's short story. She too is defined by her married state. Having Delphin Slade as a husband and for Mrs. Ansley as the father of her child becomes a mark of status rather than anything these women might do for themselves. Instead of being resentful of gender inequity and the lack of opportunities for women, they are still fighting over a guy, and he's dead. Unfortunately, there's every indication that the two women are teaching their daughters to do the same, to be competitive with one another. The women in Italy are with their daughters, helping them to look for husbands. Furthermore, the women are living vicariously through their children. Rather than support one another, these two women undermine each other while also supporting the status quo in terms of gender. As you can see, after reading the works of women and writers of color, realism becomes a way of exposing and challenging social attitudes that support bias based not only on gender, but also on race and class.